Okay, stop what you're doing. Because Warner Brothers just made a move that nobody in the fandom fully predicted, and honestly, it might be the smartest decision they've made since the original Game of Thrones was airing at its absolute peak. The first Game of Thrones theatrical film is officially happening, and they didn't go with some safe, fan service-y follow-up to House of the Dragon. They went all the way back, before the Red Wedding, before the Long Night, before the Iron Throne even existed. They went to Aegon's Conquest, the founding moment of everything we've spent over a decade obsessing over. And I genuinely think this changes the entire future of this franchise in ways that most people haven't even started to process yet. Let's just sit with that for a second. The Iron Throne, that iconic, grotesque symbol of power that defined 9 seasons of television, we're finally going to watch it get made. Not referenced in a flashback, not mentioned in dialogue, not hinted at through lore. We're going to see Balerion the Black Dread melt down the swords of Aegon's defeated enemies into that twisted seat of power, and we're going to see it happen on an IMAX screen. I don't know about you, but just saying that out loud gives me chills. Now, before we go deeper, let's acknowledge what was officially confirmed. Warner Brothers has greenlit a Game of Thrones movie centered on Aegon's Conquest, with Beau Willimon attached to write the script. For those who don't know the name, Willimon is the man behind House of Cards, the American version, the one that made political manipulation feel like an art form and turned power-hungry scheming into some of the most compelling television of the 2010s. The fact that they handed this script to him is not a random choice. That's a deliberate signal about what kind of story they intend to tell, and we're going to get into why that matters enormously in just a moment. But first, why Aegon's Conquest? Why the story? Why now? And why does it work better as a movie than another HBO series? Because honestly, that's the question a lot of people are asking. House of the Dragon is already on HBO, already expanding the universe, already doing the Targaryen thing. So why go to theaters with more of the same era? Here's the thing though, it's not the same era, and it's definitely not the same story. Aegon's Conquest is set roughly 100 years before House of the Dragon. It's the moment Aegon Targaryen, along with his 2 sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys, crossed the narrow sea with 3 dragons and essentially said, "All of Westeros belongs to us now." And the extraordinary thing is they were right. 6 of the 7 kingdoms bent the knee. One famously did not survive the attempt to resist. And by the end of it, Westeros was forged into a single realm under a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years. That is movie scale. That is not 6 seasons of slow-burn political drama. That is a 2.5-hour cinematic epic that builds to one of the most consequential moments in the history of this entire fictional world. And that's precisely why the theatrical format fits this story like a glove. Game of Thrones built its reputation on subverting expectations, on making you feel the weight of history. But the original show was always constrained by budget in its early seasons, and even later by the sheer sprawl of characters it had to juggle. A focused theatrical film about 1 conquest, 3 dragons, and the birth of a dynasty? That's a story that gets to breathe in a completely different way. Every frame can be enormous. Every battle can be truly cinematic. There are no filler episodes, no mid-season slumps. Just the full force of this story, delivered in a single, definitive experience. And speaking of enormous, can we please talk about Balerion the Black Dread, because I don't think the internet is hyping this enough. Balerion is not just a dragon. Balerion is the dragon. The largest dragon that ever lived in the history of Westeros. His skull alone, which we've seen sitting in the dungeons beneath the Red Keep in the original show, was the size of a carriage. The living creature was so massive that his shadow could swallow entire towns when he flew overhead. Drogon, whom many fans already consider the most visually spectacular thing HBO ever put on screen, was described as the largest dragon of his age, and Balerion made Drogon look modest. Putting that creature on a proper theatrical screen, with a full movie budget, full cinematic sound design, full IMAX color grading, that's not just fan service. That's a legitimate visual spectacle that could sit alongside anything in the history of fantasy filmmaking. We're talking about a sequence at Harrenhal, the greatest castle ever built in Westeros, constructed specifically to be impregnable, being reduced to melted stone in a single afternoon. That scene alone could be one of the most jaw-dropping things ever committed to film in this genre. And Harrenhal isn't just visually spectacular, it's thematically perfect. Because Aegon the Black, the king who built that impossible fortress, genuinely believed walls could stop dragons. He stacked stone higher than anyone in history, spent generations constructing what he thought was an unassailable monument to his own power, and Aegon flew Balerion overhead and turned it into a ruin in hours. That moment in the lore is one of George R.R. Martin's most elegant statements about the nature of power and arrogance, and watching it rendered in live action, with real dramatic weight behind it, could hit as hard as the Battle of the Bastards or the Loot Train attack. Maybe harder because this time we know going in that it's not just a battle. It's the moment that defined the rules of power in Westeros for the next 3 centuries. Now here's where Beau Willimon's involvement becomes genuinely exciting on a story level, not just a prestige TV credibility level. Because Aegon's Conquest is not just a military story. It's a deeply political one, and the dynamic at the center of it, between Aegon and his 2 sister wives, is something that House of the Dragon hasn't explored yet, and something that's genuinely unlike anything we've seen dramatized in this universe before. Visenya is often described as the warrior, the disciplinarian, the calculating political architect. Rhaenys is the charming one, the diplomat, the one who arguably could have won more kingdoms through persuasion than Aegon won through fire. And Aegon himself exists in this fascinating middle space, the visionary who holds the Trinity together, who has a dream about the long night that drives his entire conquest forward, a dream that, by the way, connects directly back to everything Jon Snow and Daenerys were dealing with in the original show. The fact that Aegon united Westeros not purely out of ambition, but because he foresaw the threat from the north? That threat alone could make this film feel deeply connected to the emotional core of Game of Thrones in a way that genuinely rewards long-term fans. Willimon's sensibility is perfectly calibrated for this. House of Cards wasn't about the most powerful person in the room. It was about how power is negotiated, manipulated, and seized through intelligence and patience. That's exactly what Aegon's Conquest looks like beneath the surface of the Dragonfire. The lords who bent the knee didn't all do so because they were terrified. Some were persuaded. Some were outmaneuvered politically. Some made calculated decisions about survival that were arguably more interesting than the battles themselves. If Willimon leans into that dimension of the story, the boardroom maneuvering that happened alongside the battlefield spectacle, this film could feel genuinely fresh within the franchise while still delivering the epic scope that fans are craving. And let's be honest, fans are craving it. There's a very particular kind of emotional hunger in the Game of Thrones fandom right now. House of the Dragon is genuinely good television. The second season in particular showed real creative confidence, but it doesn't quite fill the specific hole that the original show left. That feeling of watching something that felt genuinely monumental, that felt like it mattered beyond entertainment, that made you feel like you were watching history unfold. Aegon's Conquest has the potential to restore that feeling, because it literally is history unfolding. This is the story that every single event in Game of Thrones flows downstream from. The War of the Five Kings exists because of the Iron Throne, which exists because of Aegon. Daenerys' entire identity, her dragons, her conviction that she was born to rule, all of it traces back to this moment. Jon Snow's secret heritage, back to this moment. The Mad King, the Targaryens, Westeros as a unified realm. All of it, every single major storyline in 9 seasons of television, starts here. That's not a small thing to put on a movie screen. That's the origin story of the entire world. And unlike most Hollywood origin stories, this one doesn't require you to retcon or reimagine anything. It's all already there in the lore, rich and detailed, and waiting to be dramatized. Martin has written about this period extensively in Fire and Blood, and the broad strokes of the Conquest are known by every serious fan of the series. But knowing a story in your head and experiencing it dramatized with incredible performances, a soaring score, and Balerion the Black Dread filling an IMAX screen are completely different things. The Field of Fire is another sequence that deserves its own mention, because it might be the single most cinematically loaded battle in all of Westeros history. This is where all three Targaryens flew all three dragons simultaneously into a combined army of Gardner and Lannister forces. 4,000 soldiers burn alive. The Gardner line ended completely, permanently, in a single afternoon. The Lannisters, famously pragmatic, surrendered on the spot. The Field of Fire is the moment the Conquest stopped being a campaign and became inevitable. The moment every remaining king in Westeros understood that resistance wasn't courage, it was suicide. Staging that sequence with modern filmmaking technology as the climactic set piece of a proper theatrical film could be the most spectacular battle scene in the history of fantasy cinema. Not an exaggeration. That's what this material is capable of. Here's my broader theory about where this is heading strategically. Warner Brothers and HBO are clearly watching what other studios are doing with cinematic universes tied to prestige television franchises, and they're making a deliberate bet that Game of Thrones can do something nobody else has quite pulled off yet. Create a true theatrical franchise that coexists with and enhances an ongoing TV universe. If this film performs the way I think it can, we're going to see more. Maybe the Dance of the Dragons as a theatrical duology. Maybe The Long Night as a standalone film. Maybe even something set after the events of the original show. The theatrical space allows them to tell concentrated, high-stakes stories that don't require the week-to-week serialization of television. And Aegon's Conquest is the perfect proof of concept because it's simultaneously the most self-contained major event in Westerosi history and the most foundational one. This isn't just a movie. It's the beginning of a second chapter for one of the most beloved fictional worlds ever created. And if they get it right, which I genuinely believe they have the pieces in place to do, it could mean that Game of Thrones never really ended. It just evolved into something bigger. The realm was forged in fire once before. Maybe that's exactly what this franchise needs right now.